Welcome to podcast number 6 in our series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In 1629, a convoy of ships carrying mostly Puritans from Old England crossed the Atlantic to New England. On an isthmus of land, they built the city of Boston and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They weren't the first to settle the region, but they would be the most successful. In time, Massachusetts would come to dominate New England. Massachusetts had an independent, if not rebellious, attitude towards the mother country from the very start. It comes as no surprise that Massachusetts would become the flashpoint for the American War of Independence less than 15 decades later, but that was all in the future. To the Puritans who first settled there, Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Zion, a city set on a hill, and an example of godliness to the rest of the world. It was also a refuge, a place where they could wait for the reform of the Church of England or escape the Armageddon that many of them were convinced was soon at hand. At about the time that the Pilgrims were establishing their colony at Plymouth, there were a few trading posts and small fishing villages dotting the New England coast. In one of these, called Salem, lived a Reverend John White. White had a vision of a godly community somewhere in the New England area that could be an example to the world. White had connections back in England with powerful interests and people with money, people who were willing to invest in another company, and in 1629 they formed the Massachusetts Bay Company. After forming their company, they received a patent granted by the king. This was very important because there were other individuals and organizations that had claims on the New England area. Without something from the king, any colony set up there would be of questionable legal existence. One of the important and interesting details about the charter that the king granted to the Massachusetts Bay Company was that it did not have a clause specifying where the company had to be headquartered. The Virginia colony, as well as the Plymouth colony, were both run by companies who were headquartered in London, but the Massachusetts Bay Company could have been headquartered anywhere because the clause was missing in there specifying where its headquarters should be. So when the colonists left for the New World, they actually took the charter with them and set up the headquarters of the company in New England. Certainly the Crown probably intended to have a clause in there, but it was probably a clerical oversight. This important oversight was an important factor in the attitude that Massachusetts Bay had towards the mother country. The colony was very independent almost from the very beginning. Just as with the Plymouth and Virginia colonies, the investors in the Massachusetts Bay Colony expected to make money from the venture. But most of the colonists going to Massachusetts were going for religious reasons, although that did not rule out for them a chance at a better life too. While the colonists in England waited to board the convoy of ships that would take them to the New World, Reverend John Cotton gave them a scripture-laced sermon analogizing their resettlement to North America with the ancient Israelite settlement in Canaan. He reminded them that, to them that are planted by God in any place, that find rooting and establishing from God, this is a cause of much encouragement unto you, that what he hath planted he will maintain. Every plantation his right hand hath not planted shall be rooted up, but his own plantation shall prosper and flourish. During the transatlantic crossing, John Winthrop, who would serve as the colony's first governor, gave a sermon in which he said, "We must entertain each other in brotherly affection, abridge ourselves of our superfluities, for the supply of others' necessities, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the whole. We shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all the people are upon us." It's obvious from these particular excerpts that the Puritans were going to the New World for much the same reason the Pilgrims had gone over. They were going over to found a religious colony. The Puritans coming to Massachusetts Bay Colony had much in common with the Pilgrims who had founded the Plymouth colony about 30 miles to the south. The one important difference was this: the Pilgrims had illegally left England, they tried to sneak out, and they also illegally separated themselves from the Church of England. The Puritans coming to Massachusetts had not illegally separated themselves from the Church of England. Instead, they were there to wait for its further reform. But in all reality, the Puritans who came to Massachusetts were, in most ways, maybe not legally, but in practical ways, just as much separatist as the Pilgrims were down in Plymouth. The Puritans who came to Massachusetts were better prepared in many ways than the colonists who had come to Virginia's Jamestown or to the Plymouth colony. They brought with them tools and cattle. There were more of them. And unlike Virginia, they also brought women with them. They came over in families. This ensured that they would multiply faster, as well as having a balance in society that was more stable than what we had down in Virginia. In 1630, the convoy of ships carrying the Puritans from England arrived off the coast of New England, and they began looking for a place to settle. They established the town of Boston, naming it after a city in England that some of the colonists were from, and made it the colonial capital of Massachusetts Bay Colony. The location of Boston was excellent. It was on what appeared to be a large island of land connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land, so it was nearly surrounded by water. It had enough space to build houses and businesses, but because it was entirely surrounded by water, it was defensible. It also had plenty of room to build shipyards and dockyards for commercial interests. The narrow neck of land to the mainland gave it also overland access to the interior towns. It would not be long before Boston would be the commercial hub for all of New England. By the end of 1630, 11 towns had been established near Boston, and there were over 1,000 colonists residing in the colony of Massachusetts Bay. Not everything went well, of course. They had the same difficulties the other colonies had with death and illness. Several hundred people died in that first year. In fact, when a ship called the Lion from England came to bring supplies and new colonists to Boston the next year, several hundred colonists crammed aboard it to try and get back to England. They were probably done trying to colonize. Despite these setbacks, Massachusetts Bay Colony did thrive better than either Virginia or Plymouth Colony. One of the reasons that New England probably saw a greater increase in growth had to do with the weather conditions. The weather conditions in New England were more similar to those in England, and the colonists were used to the cooler weather. It wasn't like Virginia, which was hot during the summer and had mosquito-ridden swamps. John Winthrop had been chosen as the colony's first governor. He was a good leader, but he liked to confine the power to just him and a few assistants that were helping him. When the freemen of the colony demanded to see the charter, they discovered that they were allowed to choose their leaders, and so they promptly elected someone else to be their next governor. Because the travel conditions were difficult for all the freemen of the colony to meet together every year, they instead appointed deputies or representatives from each of the towns to represent them instead and help make the laws and enact the ordinances for the colony. In this way, Massachusetts Bay Colony transformed itself from a private company governed by its management into a true civil government. Unlike the southern colonies, where the county was the most important unit of local government, in New England the towns were the most important unit of local government. It was at town meetings that the people could come and vent their anger or make demands on the leaders or give instructions to the representatives to the general court. Despite Massachusetts' promising growth, there were internal religious factors that limited personal freedoms. I call this the Puritan Paradox, because the Puritans had fled from England to avoid persecution and to establish a religious community organized the way they thought it should be, yet they would not allow other people to have the freedom to worship as they pleased. The Puritans believed it was their duty to keep their city on a hill as an example to the rest of the world of what godliness could do. So they felt it was their job to make sure that everyone living there was living the way that was godly according to how they understood the Bible. If you came to the colony and you happened to be Presbyterian or Anglican or Baptist or Quaker, you could be banished. If you came back, you could be whipped, and in extreme cases, you may even be executed. This was not a simple matter of religious intolerance so much as it was just their way of keeping their community pure so that they would not incur the wrath of God. Only Puritans could vote, and everyone who lived in Massachusetts Bay Colony had to pay taxes to support their local clergy. Technically, it's not true to say that Massachusetts had a state church, because the Puritans, or Congregationalists as they were often called, did not have a church hierarchy or structure. Everything was governed at the local level, the congregational level. But it is true to say that Massachusetts had a state religion, which was enforced by the colonial government. As was mentioned earlier, Massachusetts had an independent streak from the very beginning, which, when combined with the persecution of other religions, irritated officials back in England, including the king himself. In fact, within a few years after the founding of the Massachusetts colony, the king initiated proceedings in the court to revoke their charter. He wanted to take control of the colony as he had done to Virginia. The fact that the king had to resort to initiating court proceedings says a lot about how England had evolved politically. In medieval times, the king probably could have just issued a warrant or an order on his own to do this, but it shows that there had been limits placed on the king, and there were laws in place that the king was expected to follow himself. Now, even though the proceedings were initiated against the colony, the king was not able to follow through. He was busy engaged in things at home, including a civil war with Parliament that ended up in him being executed. And it's important to note how much lack of supervision there was over the colonies during this time. They were virtually autonomous units, occasionally receiving some direction from London, but for the most part they were very much on their own and independent. Frequently, England was at war with other European powers, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French. In some ways, these wars helped to bind the colonies to the mother country more closely, but other than this, they pretty much went unsupervised. In the late 1680s, King James II decided he would try to reform colonial administration. He combined all the New England colonies, along with New York and New Jersey, into one grand colony that he called the Dominion of New England. The strategy ended up failing, and James ended up having to flee England. We'll do a separate podcast on that whole thing later. But the result was that Massachusetts had to go to the new king, William III, to get a new charter. The charter of 1691 in many ways resembled the earlier charter of 1629, but it made important changes in the government. From now on, the king would appoint the governor, and the colony was forced to accept a certain degree of religious tolerance. One of the episodes in early Massachusetts history that deserves mention are the Salem Witchcraft Trials of 1692. In February of that year, two girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began having symptoms. They had fits or seizures, and it came out that they had been putting egg whites into glasses of water to try and see the image of their future husbands. A slave named Tituba, who belonged to Betty Paris's father, who was a Caribbean Indian, knew a little witchcraft of her own. She decided to help the girls by making a rye cake made out of rye meal mixed with the urine from these girls, and she fed it to a dog. This was supposed to reveal who it was that was tormenting the girls. A doctor was called for to examine the girls, and not finding anything wrong, he concluded that they were being bewitched by someone or something. And then all this came out about them putting egg whites into water and Tituba feeding the meal cake to the dog, etc. And the two girls decided they would accuse other women in the town of bewitching them. Pretty soon, other accusations of witchcraft were flying, and the Governor Phipps, set up a special court to hear the cases. The Puritans believed that people in league with the devil could send their specter to other people at night to torment them and to get them to become in league with the devil. Many of these girls were accusing other people of sending their specter to torment them by night. The accused, if they were able to say the Lord's Prayer in open court, could be found innocent of these charges, but that would be a lot of stress and pressure to recite it from memory fluently in front of a packed audience, especially when your own life is possibly hanging in the balance. Many of the accused people were subjected to physical exams to see if they had marks of the devil, or perhaps had an extra teat on them from which they could suckle Satan's offspring. Many of the accusers had fits of writhing pain, or they would go into swooning spells when they saw the people they had accused. One young girl accused her mother even of turning into a black cat and trying to get her to swear on the devil's book to make a covenant with the devil. Within a few months of the first accusations made back in February, accusations of witchcraft had spread to 4 other neighboring towns around Salem, and by October, over 140 people had been indicted. 19 people were hung, and one man who refused to enter a plea with the court was crushed to death under a pile of rocks. Many people fled or went into hiding to avoid being accused at all. Some people, in order to avoid execution, simply confessed to practicing witchcraft, and in this way they avoided execution, but they risked having their estates confiscated and their lives ruined. The demographics of who did the accusing and who was accused are somewhat interesting. Most of the accusers were young women or girls, and most of those who were accused were women that were tended to be a little older, middle age, or older. Some men did get dragged in, either defending their wife who was doing the accusing, or as the case in Corey Giles, who was crushed to death, he had tried to defend his wife who had been accused of witchcraft. By this time, many prominent clergymen became concerned about the methods of the court. They didn't doubt that there was witchcraft, and they had no problem with stamping it out, but they were concerned with how the court was going about it. One of these particularly prominent clergymen named Increase Mather said he would rather see one witch go free than 10 innocent people be killed or put to death. It was about this time that Governor Phipps stepped in and put an end to the trials, which was probably a good thing since his own wife had been accused. Several years after the trials, one of the judges, Samuel Sewell, even made mention of the fact that he felt sad and ashamed that he had participated in them, and even called the proceedings a sin. The colony of Massachusetts attempted to compensate some people whose lives had been ruined by the witchcraft trials in 1711, but interestingly, nothing was done to the judges or the people who made the accusations. There had been witchcraft trials in the past before 1692, but nothing ever quite reached the level of hysteria that was experienced in this round of witchcraft trials. Perhaps it had one good benefit. The witchcraft trials were never repeated after that, and I think, too, you can argue that these witchcraft trials were so embarrassing that they helped loosen the theocratic dictatorship the Puritans had on the colony. I don't think Stephen King could have written a modern story with more spooky drama than the Salem witchcraft trials. From our vantage centuries later, it is hard to imagine otherwise educated people participating in something so obviously flawed and silly. The best way to sum up the Salem witchcraft trials is that they were both at the same time ridiculous and tragic. Because of the religious rigidness of the Puritans, it is easy to see Massachusetts in a negative light, but there were also many good things happening. For example, the colony passed laws requiring each town to have a public school. After all, if the children could not read, how could they learn God's Word? Also, within the first decade of its founding, Massachusetts set aside money to establish a college, which became Harvard University. The original purpose of Harvard was to train clergymen. Between 1630 and 1643, Massachusetts benefited from a mass exodus of Puritans from England to the New World. During that time, tens of thousands of them, my own ancestors included, settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It became one of the most successful colonies ever founded by Englishmen. Its capital city, Boston, became one of the largest cities in the English Empire. Massachusetts was the flashpoint for the American Revolution. It was in Boston that the Sons of Liberty were first formed. Some of the most famous names in American history, including Samuel Adams, John and Abigail Adams, Paul Revere, and John Hancock, were from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts' first state constitution served as an important model for the United States Constitution. For further reading, I recommend the following books and articles: Colonial Massachusetts, A History by Benjamin W. LaBarrie, The American Colonies, From Settlement to Independence by R.C. Simmons, Controversies Between Royal Governors and Their Assemblies in the Northern American Colonies by John Francis Burns, The Religious History of America, The Heart of the American Story from Colonial Times to Today by Edwin Gausted and Leigh Schmidt. I also recommend the following articles: Colony or Commonwealth, Massachusetts Bay from 1661 to 1666 by Paul R. Lucas, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 24, Number 1, January 1967, and The Missing Clause, Myth and the Massachusetts Bay Charter of 1629 by Ronald Dale Carr, published in the New England Quarterly, Volume 77, Number 1, March 2004.